In the winter of 2017, between February 3rd and March 5th, the federal government established a massive, overlapping security perimeter around Palm Beach, Florida. This operation covered 4 consecutive presidential trips. Executing them required a synchronized deployment across multiple federal agencies, moving personnel, heavy machinery, and tactical assets over thousands of miles. The aggregate financial footprint for just this 1-month window was $13.6 million. We know this exact figure because of the Government Accountability Office, which documented the expenditures in a specific audit, Report GAO 19178. But that audit reveals a deeper administrative failure. A federal law passed in 1976 already requires the government to routinely track and report the costs of executive protection. Despite that statutory mandate, the reporting system was broken. The GAO had to bypass normal channels and manually reconstruct that $13 million figure from scratch. To understand why federal oversight failed so completely, we first have to reverse engineer the actual logistical anatomy of a modern presidential deployment. A federal audit begins by defining boundaries. Before the GAO can tally a total, they have to define what legally counts as a travel cost. The first thing the auditors exclude are standard federal salaries and benefits. The logic is straightforward. These agents, pilots, and military personnel are paid their baseline salaries, regardless of whether the president is traveling to Florida or sitting in the Oval Office. Those are fixed costs. What remains falls into 2 primary accounting buckets. The first is temporary duty, or TDY. TDY represents the ground-level expenses of keeping personnel in the field. This covers daily per diems, hotel lodgings, commercial airfare, and rental vehicles. The second major accounting bucket is operational costs. These are the hard expenses of asset deployment: fuel consumption, equipment rentals, and the single most expensive metric in government travel, aircraft flight hours. This chart illustrates the financial breakdown of those Palm Beach trips. The split is stark. Out of $13.6 million, $10.5 million went to operational costs, compared to just $3 million for temporary duty. Heavy logistical machinery outspends individual personnel expenses by a factor of more than 3 to 1. Executive travel is primarily an exercise in moving heavy machinery, not accommodating people. The agency responsible for the vast majority of that heavy machinery is the Department of Defense. Across the 4 Palm Beach deployments, the DoD incurred roughly $8.4 million in costs. This graph breaks down that $8.4 million. Aircraft cost per flight hour consumes nearly 90% of the budget. A significant portion of this belongs to the 89th Airlift Wing, which operates Air Force One. Running parallel to that is the Air Mobility Command. Their job is to move the necessary support infrastructure into place ahead of the president's arrival. The Air Mobility Command stages specialized heavy equipment via cargo aircraft. This includes transporting the armored presidential limousines from various bases to the destination. The military also handles secondary airlift requirements, such as transporting Marine Corps helicopters to Joint Base Andrews to ensure rotary transport is standing by. Next to these massive airlift expenses, the DoD's temporary duty costs for ground personnel barely register. Those smaller TDY expenses cover specialized tactical assets, like explosive ordnance disposal units and military working dog teams conducting advanced sweeps. The Department of Defense's financial footprint is entirely defined by its role as the overarching logistical transport engine. The second major player in these deployments is the Department of Homeland Security, which accounted for $5 million. But DHS spending is split between 2 sub-agencies, utilizing entirely different operational models. This table breaks down the internal DHS costs. The Secret Service incurred a total of $1.6 million. They rely heavily on temporary duty costs, racking up $1.5 million in TDY compared to only $94,000 in operational expenses. This happens because the Secret Service operates on human capital. They deploy advanced teams and draw manpower from field offices to build overlapping security layers. Contrast that with the Coast Guard's $3.4 million share. They revert right back to a hardware-centric model, accumulating $2.9 million in heavy operational costs. Their specific mandate is to maintain physical maritime security zones. They draw response boats, deployable aircraft, and cutters to lock down the waterways. The financial model shifts again when looking at family members. For 3 international trips taken by the president's adult children, the Secret Service spent $396,000. Because these protectees flew on commercial aircraft, the military's heavy transport costs were entirely absent from the ledger. Even within a single cabinet department, the cost structure morphs radically depending on whether the mission requires human intelligence layers or physical perimeter hardware. Understanding the physical execution of these deployments leads back to the bureaucratic systems legally required to track them. In 1976, Congress passed the Presidential Protection Assistance Act. The law was designed to centralize cost accountability by requiring the Secret Service, Coast Guard, and DoD to deliver semi-annual expenditure reports directly to Congress. Yet the GAO found that between fiscal years 2015 and 2017, the Coast Guard was the only agency to actually comply with the law. This visual represents the internal reporting pipelines for each agency. To see why two agencies failed while one succeeded, we have to look at how data moves through them. The Coast Guard pipeline worked because they implemented hard-coded business rules. Their policy explicitly demanded that data be collected within 14 days and validated within 30. The Secret Service pipeline collapsed because it relied on undocumented tribal knowledge. When management transitioned in 2016, the institutional memory vanished. The Department of Defense suffered a failure of architecture. They had internal policies to track costs, but no mechanism to actually push the data out to Congress. Statutory laws cannot enforce themselves without rigid internal agency codification. The most highly trained tactical field operations in the world remain vulnerable to basic administrative churn if their reporting mechanisms aren't institutionalized. This brings us back to the original $13.6 million figure. Generating that number requires the high-stakes synchronization of air mobility wings, maritime sectors, and field offices scattered across the country. The sheer complexity of this joint interagency footprint makes ad hoc accounting or retroactive auditing practically impossible. Because of this, the GAO issued a final recommendation demanding that these agencies establish and enforce codified policy oversight mechanisms moving forward. Protecting the executive branch is a massive logistical operation, but documenting its cost to the public requires a similarly disciplined system of internal reporting and oversight.